Paul's Case, A Study in Character by Willa Cather. Chapter 1. It was Paul's afternoon to appear before the faculty of the Pittsburgh High School to account for his various misdemeanors. He had been suspended a week ago, and his father had called at the principal's office and confessed that he was confused about the situation that transpired between a few teachers and his son. Paul entered the faculty room, suave and smiling. His clothes were a trifle outgrown, and the tan velvet on the collar of his open overcoat was frayed and worn. But for all that, there was something of the dandy about him. He wore an opal pin in his neatly knotted bow tie, as well as a red carnation in his buttonhole. This flashy attire made the faculty somehow feel that Paul was not properly dressed in the spirit befitting a boy under the ban of suspension. Paul was tall for his age and very thin, with high, cramped shoulders and a narrow chest. His eyes were remarkable, holding a certain hysterical brilliancy which he continually used in a conscious, theatrical sort of way, which came off as offensive. Paul's pupils were abnormally large, as though he were addicted to belladonna. However, there was a glassy glitter about his eyes which that drug does not produce. When the teachers questioned by the principal as to why he was there, Paul stated, politely enough, that he wanted to come back to school. This was a lie, but Paul was quite accustomed to lying, found it indeed an action for overcoming friction. His teachers were asked to state their respective charges, which they did with such anger and aggressiveness. Disorder, impertinence were among the offenses named, yet each of his instructors felt that it was hardly possible to put into words the real cause of the trouble, which could be stated that Paul's hysterically defiant manner was the root cause. Once, when he had been making a point about a paragraph at the blackboard, his English teacher had stepped to his side and attempted to guide his hand. Paul flew back with a shudder and thrust his hands violently behind him. The astonished woman could barely have been more hurt physically, but was more so embarrassed and upset that he was disrupting class. The insult wasn't on purpose, but it wasn't forgettable. In one way and another, he made all his teachers, men and women alike, conscious of this same feeling. His teachers felt this afternoon that his whole attitude was symbolized by his shrug and his flippantly red carnation flower, and they fell upon him without mercy. He stood through it, smiling, his pale lips parted over his white teeth. His lips were continually twitching, and he had a habit of raising his eyebrows that was contemptuous and irritating to the last degree. Older boys than Paul had broken down and shed tears under the teacher's baptism of fire, but his set smile did not once desert him, and his only sign of discomfort was the nervous trembling of the fingers that toyed with the buttons of his overcoat, and on occasional jerking of the other hand that held his hat. Paul was always smiling, always glancing about him, seeming to feel that people might be watching him and trying to detect something. As the inquisition proceeded, one of his instructors repeated an impertinent remark of the boys, and the principal asked him whether he thought if his comments were appropriate. Paul shrugged his shoulders slightly, and his eyebrows twitched. "I don't know," he replied. "I didn't mean to be polite or impolite either. I guess it's just sort of a way I have of saying things, regardless." The principal, who was a sympathetic man, asked him whether he could have acted better in his performance. Paul grinned and said he guessed so. and when he was told that he could go, he bowed gracefully and went out. His bow was but a repetition of the scandalous red carnation. His teachers were in despair, and his drawing master voiced the feeling of them all when he declared there was something about the boy which none of them understood. He added, "I don't really believe that smile of his comes altogether from insolence. There's something sort of haunted about it. The boy is not strong, for one thing. I happen to know that he was born in Colorado, only a few months before his mother died, out there of a long illness. There is something wrong about the fellow." The drawing master had come to realize that, in looking at Paul, one saw only his white teeth and the forced animation of his eyes. One warm afternoon, the boy had gone to sleep at his drawing board, and his master had noticed his amazement of Paul's white, blue-veined face, drawn and wrinkled like an old man's about the eyes, the lips twitching even in his sleep, and stiff with a nervous tension that drew them back from his teeth. As for Paul, he ran down the hill whistling the soldier's chorus from Faust, looking wildly behind him now and then to see whether some of his teachers were there to ruin his lightheartedness. As it was now late in the afternoon, and Paul was on duty that evening as usher in the Carnegie Hall, he decided that he would not go home to supper, but would instead hang about an Oakland tobacconist's shop until it was time to go to the concert hall. When Paul reached the usher's dressing room at about 7:30 that evening, half a dozen boys were there already, and Paul began excitedly to tumble into his uniform. His attire was one of the few that was a perfect fitting, and he thought it was very becoming, though he knew that the tight straitcoat accentuated his narrow chest, about which he was self-conscious about. He was always considerably excited while he dressed, twanging all over to the tuning of the strings and the preliminary flourishes of the horns in the music room. But tonight he seemed quite beside himself, for he teased and plagued the boys until telling him that he was crazy and put Paul down on the floor and sat on him. Somewhat calmed by his suppression, Paul dashed out to the front of the house to seat the early comers. He was a model usher. Gracious and smiling, he ran up and down the aisles. Nothing was too much trouble for him. He carried messages and brought programs as though it was his greatest pleasure in life. And all the people in his section thought him a charming boy, feeling that he remembered and admired them. As the house filled, he grew more and more vivacious and animated, and the color came to his cheeks and lips. It was very much as though this were a great reception, and Paul were the host. When the symphony began, Paul sank into one of the rear seats with a long sigh of relief. It was not that symphonies as such meant anything in particular to Paul, but the first sigh of the instruments seemed to free some hilarious, impotent spirit within him, something that struggled there like the genius in the bottle found by the Arab fisherman. He felt a sudden zest of life. The lights danced before his eyes, and the concert hall blazed into unimaginable splendor. When the soprano soloist came on, Paul half closed his eyes and gave himself up to the peculiar sounds. The soloist was no way near to royalty, but she wore an elaborate gown and a tiara, and above all, she had the undefinable air of achievement. The world shine upon her, which, in Paul's eyes, made her a veritable queen of romance. After a concert was over, Paul was always irritable and wretched until he got to sleep, and tonight he was even more than usually restless. He had the feeling of not being able to let down, of its being impossible to give up this delicious excitement, which was the only thing that could be called living at all. During the last number, he withdrew and, after hastily changing his clothes in the dressing room, slipped out to the side door where the soprano's carriage stood. Here he began pacing rapidly up and down the walk, waiting to see her come out. Over yonder, near Shenley Park, in its vacant stretch, loomed big and square through the fine rain, the windows of its 12 stories glowing like those of the lighted cardboard house under a Christmas tree. All the actors and singers of the better class stayed there when they were in the city, and a number of the big manufacturers of the place lived there in the winter. Paul had often hung about the hotel, watching the people go in and out, longing to enter and leave schoolmasters and dull care behind him forever. At last the singer came out, accompanied by the conductor, who helped her into her carriage and closed the door with the cordial Auf Wiedersehen, which set Paul to wondering whether she were not an old sweetheart of his. Paul followed the carriage over to the hotel, walking so rapidly as to not be far from the entrance when the singer alighted and disappeared behind the swinging glass doors that were opened by a black man in a tall hat and a long coat. And the moment that the door was ajar, it seemed to Paul that he too entered. He seemed to feel himself go after her up the steps, into the warm, lighted building, into an exotic, a tropical world of shiny, glistening surfaces and basking ease. He reflected upon the mysterious dishes that were brought into the dining room, the green bottles and buckets of ice, as he had seen them in the supper party pictures of the Sunday World Supplement. A quick gust of wind brought the rain down with a sudden vehemence, and Paul was startled to find that he was still outside in the slush of the gravel driveway, that his boots were letting in the water, and his scanty overcoat was clinging wet about him, that the lights in front of the concert hall were out, and the rain was driving in sheets between him and the orange glow of the windows above him. There it was, what he wanted, tangibly before him, like the fairy world of a Christmas pantomime, but mocking spirits stood guard at the doors, and as the rain beat in his face, Paul wondered whether he was destined always to shiver in the black night outside, looking up at it. He turned and walked reluctantly toward the car tracks. The end had to come sometime. His father in his nightclothes at the top of the stairs, explanations that did not explain his lateness, friction that was forever tripping him up, his upstairs room and its horrible yellow wallpaper. Half an hour later, Paul crept from his car and went slowly down one of the side streets off the main thoroughfare. Paul never went up Cordelia Street without a shudder of loathing. He approached it tonight with the nerveless sense of defeat, the hopeless feeling of sinking back forever into ugliness and commonness that he always had when he came home. The moment he turned into Cordelia Street, he felt the waters close above his head. After each of these nights of living, he experienced physical depression, the loathing of respectable beds, of common food, of a house penetrated by kitchen odors, a shuddering repulsion for the flavorless, colorless mass of everyday existence, a morbid desire for cool things and soft lights and fresh flowers.